Hello and welcome to the Product Shipping Forecast, where we help you navigate the treacherous waters of product development. I'm Rob, a product designer at Zero Height, and I'm joined by my co-host and product engineering colleague, Rosie.
Hi, Rob.
Uh, this month, we are diving into the concepts of flops. I'm sure most people have kind of had times in their careers where they've been working on features or even entire products that have kind of landed with absolutely zero impact or just not really hit the goals that they kind of set out for. So we really wanted to try and dig into like what can we do in these situations, what can we learn about them, and how can we best avoid that in the future. So I think to kind of like kick us off, I'm really interested, Rosie. Like, what's the first feature you remember working on that flopped?
Now, this one I actually found difficult. So I was trying to think about my first one. So I sort of, jumped straight back to my first job. And I'm not saying everything there was perfect, but it's more like I was really trying to think about a feature that flopped. And I think in like the context of an e-commerce job, it was a bit harder. So I've jumped to a bit more of a recent time, which was one of my first jobs, sort of working on more of like a product rather than e-commerce. And it was essentially this learning app for kids. And there was this concept of hearts added into the app. And it was essentially a sort of like currency, I guess is how you could put it. People would sort of do certain levels, earn hearts. You could only earn a certain amount of hearts per day, but there wasn't really a way to use them. I think there was originally like the intention that you would like unlock. I think you did have to potentially get a certain number of hearts to unlock a new level, but it was almost impossible to not get enough hearts to unlock it. And so it was sort of this concept that even internally we didn't necessarily understand. And so our users definitely didn't understand it. And there was a lot of issues in the code around it. And that's how I first sort of discovered it was such a flop, because I didn't even know it existed until I was trying to add something in. And I was like, oh, what's a heart? Do I need to take this into consideration? And even like to the point of like trying to remove them. Some people had spent a long time collecting these imaginary hearts and were really quite attached to them. They were like, oh, I've got 542 hearts. And you're like, oh, well, if we remove them, are people going to be upset? And so it just kind of like stayed there stagnant. And I don't think it helped anyone. It didn't help the product grow. It didn't help us add new things to the product. And I don't think it was particularly helpful to the user. And it just kind of sat there. And I think, yeah, that was definitely my first encounter of a flop.
Yeah, it feels like there's probably a lot of products out there that have kind of added a sort of half-baked gamification system. They're sort of like, well, we'll add some sort of currency and we'll figure out the details later. But gamification is good for engagement, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we ended up realizing that we still wanted some sort of gamification, but rather than going the route of currency, it was more like achievement driven, which is much easier to keep track of because it's much more static, and it's kind of like once you have it, you have it, and you don't expect it to do anything else. But yeah, it was definitely interesting to see. Like, one of the pros was that people were interested in collecting something. Like, I think that was like the learning we took from it. But overall, the feature just really did not take off and ended up just kind of sitting there. It might still be there. I don't know. I haven't checked. But it didn't get removed in my time. So yeah, we'll see. Do you have any examples from sort of like different industries or anything, Rob?
Yeah, I think like you, I struggled a little bit to think of stuff from like very early in my career. I sort of started an agency, so there's a lot of things I worked on that did flop, but often more from like external pressures, just typical, it's an agency, the client has requirements, and sometimes they don't listen to your expertise when you say, maybe this isn't the right path. But I think one that really occurred to me was many years ago, I was working for a fintech, and kind of the big thing at the time was we're sort of pre-open banking in the UK, where there's kind of a push for banks to be able to share information and help people kind of pull together information from a bunch of different sources. We were looking at kind of how we could kind of do that a little bit earlier. There were a bunch of kind of tools out there like Mint and Parity and tools like Emma that kind of came up around the same time that were looking at like aggregating data together. And we had a bunch of research that kind of showed like this would be really useful to people. Mint in particular was like pretty big in the US, but it was very popular with like very tech savvy, very money savvy people who wanted a lot of like spreadsheeting and kind of data visualization around their finances. And we were like, okay, cool. Well, how do we take this idea and make it more accessible to the general public? And so we kind of built out these features. We started to kind of look at ways that we could use aggregation to help people understand their finances, help them kind of understand like how much money they might have left to spend each month, all that kind of like fun stuff that you'd take to user tests, you'd do in research, and really resonated. And then we released the feature, and like we got a lot of downloads, we got a lot of signups, but we got like very little actual conversion through the funnel. And it's actually like a long running project to try and figure out like what was actually happening. A big challenge there was just like security. Like you're coming up against the thing of like, people in the UK in particular very encouraged to be very security conscious around their kind of like financial information, and encouraging some level of like trust in a sort of new product that'd be like, hey, give us your bank details, we can help you manage your money, is slightly scary. And we kind of tried all those kind of ideas of like putting security information up front, telling people that things are encrypted, but again, you're always kind of running into that issue of our internal understanding is like, well, this is super secure, but how do you communicate that to a user base that maybe doesn't understand what encryption is at the time? And how do you also kind of just get around the fact that you are basically asking people to do stuff that their bank would encourage them technically to not do, because again, this was pre kind of like a lot of the open banking APIs coming into effect, which were kind of still a few years out at this point.
I think especially when you're like obviously I think the company you work for is like somewhat known, but some people wouldn't know them. And I think even now, even with some of the open banking stuff and like obviously actually having some understanding of how it works, I'm still very skeptical when I sort of see companies that maybe I don't necessarily recognize the brand and I'm not sure exactly who it is that's running it behind the scenes. You are definitely more cautious, so I can see where that struggled.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting when a couple of years later, when open banking was actually in place and we were able to actually use APIs and go through those systems, it made it so much easier to actually get people to try it, because they were getting redirected to their own banking app, being like, do you approve this connection? And all the kind of things you'd normally expect when you're like signing in with like Google to a new service you're signing up to. And really just kind of shows how much like user expectations can just like make or break a feature. So yeah, kind of a big one there, but one that we sunk a lot of time into, I think.
No, definitely. I think that's probably going to be a big point we'll come back to a few times around user expectations. So I guess it does kind of lead us nicely onto the point of how do you define a flop?
Yeah, that is an interesting one, right? I think there's the kind of obvious, the adoption of a feature just isn't particularly high, right? Like you put something out there and your conversion rate is just much lower than you expect. And hopefully, when you're putting features out there, you have an idea of what you're expecting to kind of see. You're expecting users to actually like investigate the feature. You're expecting a certain amount of conversion. You're never expecting 100%, right? But a lot of like the kind of aggregation feature, we were seeing a lot of signups. We weren't seeing that in conversions. It was really like falling off a cliff at a certain point. I think that is like probably the key way, but I think there are also a bunch of other things that are worth taking into account, particularly in terms of like how are people specifically using it. The features we've launched in the past, at other companies that have had a lot of kind of like initial conversion, but then the stickiness just isn't there. They're not coming back month on month to actually kind of keep using that feature, or maybe they're just not coming back with the kind of regularity you'd expect. Is this something that should be driving daily active users? Should it be driving weekly? And then you're not actually seeing that kind of follow through on a feature.
I think that's one of the like key points is each feature is going to be different. Some things you would expect, take an example from Zero Height currently, right? Like we've reflected a few times on, we added in the ability to add private NPM packages as part of code blocks. And I feel like it's a feature we've reflected on a lot, because at points we've considered it a flop, but other points not so much. And I think a lot of it's come from like the misunderstanding of how a feature like that would be used, because there's high chance that actually you set it up and then you leave it. And so
Mhm.
we're kind of only expecting people to really use it once, which means that there's going to be a lot less people using it because we're not seeing people come back, versus other features where, you know, our more recent features around like developer adoption, actually we want to probably encourage people to come back more often. And so we do care a little bit more about how well it's sticking, if people are coming back to it or if they're just sort of like setting it up and walking away. And I think that's kind of one of the defining points, along with like, yeah, how quickly people take them up. Some features are super easy for people to take up quickly, right? Like if you present
Yeah.
it to them on the homepage, they're going to be like, oh yeah, perfect, I'll set that up. Versus like I've worked on a feature before that was largely like involved, like it was quite a social feature. So you'd want to like add your friends and then you would sort of like share. It was if you completed the level, you sort of like take a photo of yourself and you'd like share it around with your friends. But it was a slow burn for it to pick up. So at first we were kind of like, oh, no one cares about this. But actually it was because it was like, why would I share a photo if my friend isn't also like in that same group platform thing, because I'm sharing it to no one. And so it actually took a lot of encouragement to get people onto it. And then once people were on it, it started ticking over and other people would join in. And so yeah, you had to measure that so differently from other features that might be a bit more sort of like straightforward.
Yeah, that expectation around, when does someone adopt and like what is the right time for someone to adopt and how that factors into, your goals and the success of a product, I think is super interesting. Because I think like it's like the big thing I've learned like when I moved from B2C, working on like consumer fintech to working on B2B, either at my previous company or here, is that in the B2B world, you're much more beholden to like what people's workflows, what their processes are. And so often, you work on a feature, you think, this is great, like this is really going to answer like a user need, research backs it up. You do some initial kind of like testing, you really kind of proves that like there's enthusiasm for it. And then you release it, nothing happens, and you're kind of like, what did we screw up? And it turns out you didn't really screw anything up. It's just, users need the time to kind of factor that in. I think we saw that quite recently with some of the adoption stuff that we've been working on. As you say, we, you know, we sort of set up an open beta list where we were getting people to kind of like sign up, and we had loads of enthusiasm, loads of people like we thought kind of clamoring to use this feature. And we release it to kind of an open beta, and the uptake just wasn't kind of what we were expecting it to be. And so, Nick, our product manager, kind of started setting up some calls and emails, and actually, like an overwhelming piece of feedback we are getting back was like, yeah, we're really eager to try this out. We're just really busy at the moment. We're in the midst of like revamping our design system, or we have components that we need to ship this quarter. So we're really hoping that we can come back to towards the end of the month, or when we've got a little bit of slack in our in our work to kind of actually get in and investigate. And that's a little disheartening that we're not seeing any immediate use, but it's also really encouraging that people want to give time to actually properly set something up and figure out how it works, rather than just kind of like have a quick look, go and then sort of move on. So it's always kind of that element as well of like understanding, like, do you have the right level of expectation on that feature itself? And I think also that kind of extends to, does the wider business understand that that's the right level of expectation? Because I've found this in other jobs where we haven't clearly communicated like what our goals were. I think I spoke about this on like a previous episode when we were looking at kind of energy switching. And internally within the product team, we had this idea of like, what we're interested in is, are we getting people to actually start the switching flow? Not are we actually making people switch their energy supplier? Because we sort of knew that the switching flow was not great, but we hadn't put time and effort into that. We want to just prove, is there appetite? But then of course this feature was deemed a flop because the wider business was just looking at that headline number of how many people have actually switched their energy, which wasn't the thing that we had built the feature to actually influence or measure. So I think that's always another thing to consider when you're thinking about it. Is something a flop or not?
absolutely. So I guess we can jump onto talk about the difference between big or small feature flops. And by this, I guess there's kind of two sides to this, right? One of them is whether or not something sort of like flops hard or just flops a little bit. And I guess the other thing is whether or not you've done a huge feature or something small. Because I guess I've had experience of back when I worked for like an e-commerce company, we didn't really necessarily do massive features. Lots of the changes we were making were more testing small things. So you wouldn't necessarily spend a load of time on it. You'd maybe spend like a sprint or so. You'd add in a new place where they can, add an extra purchase to their basket. And you basically test and say, hey, do people actually use this, or is it stopping people from checking out? And it would just be easy, and you'd just be like, cool, throw it away. It doesn't work, get rid of it. Whereas now, sort of being in a more like product focused company, often we spend a lot of time thinking about something, working on it for a while. Nick does a lot of like thinking about how it fits into the product. You then do a lot of thinking around design, and then there's at least 3 of us engineers working to get it in.
Yeah.
And we do always try and build things in a way where we're like, well, we'll put it behind a feature flag, which generally is in case it breaks rather than in case you want to turn it off. But there is the concept of, if this is really bad, do we take it out? And I don't think we've actually done that yet within our team. But yeah, I didn't know if you had any thoughts around any of that.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like, the best advice is to try and keep, things relatively constrained, right? Like, I guess there's 2 aspects. The first is like, how confident are you in whatever feature you're putting out there? Like, the more confident you are, then the kind of bigger you can go with it, the more you can kind of like, integrate into existing systems to, kind of fit a bit more naturally. If you're super not sure, like, how can you validate that first to kind of minimize that risk, and then how can you build something in a way that makes it easy to disconnect if necessary? I think whilst I don't think we'll do this, the adoption features that we've been looking at more recently, we've kind of built, they're in the main product, but they are their own tab. They do have a little bit of disconnect to kind of core zero height features. So it does mean that if that feature was a complete failure, it wouldn't be too difficult to kind of disconnect it from the product itself. And that kind of allows us to just be a little bit more experimental with what we're doing, build upon it, and kind of see what works, as opposed to, for example, if we like deeply integrate it into analytics or into style guides themselves, for example, like, which are things that we had like toyed around with a little bit as we started working on it. But I think then makes it much riskier of like having to support something long term that might not actually make sense. And I think that's always the way you've got to try and look at it. The other is just thinking about, what do you need, like, if you need to build something, like, what do you need to build to start to get an idea for if it works, or figure out what you need to do to kind of make that thing really sing as a feature. And I guess like some of that comes down to the age old like MVP kind of discourse, right? What is a minimum sort of viable version of the feature you want to ship that will let you get a bit of kind of insight into how is this thing being adopted, and how can you then kind of build upon that and kind of grow that foundation. I guess, like, is there anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting that I guess the term MVP, which gets thrown around all the time, it's interesting to me how people see it and what word people use for the V, because I personally wouldn't go with viable anymore. And I think that's after having done various different MVPs at different companies and different teams, things like that. And I think I've learned that MVP can be very confusing if you say minimum viable product. And I think I prefer the word. I'm more of a value
minimum
person.
Lovable. Oh, you're going for much more boring value, not the minimum lovable product.
I've not heard that one, and I don't like it.
That
No.
was big in design circles for a while.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna stick with valuable.
Yeah.
And I do actually think it's the way that like we try and do it.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely ways we could have done certain things quicker to make them viable and make them work. But I think when you've got a product that people are already like using and loving, and like obviously we've got like quite a consistent amount of people that use Zero Height and love Zero Height. You know, the company's been going for a while, the product's been there. We don't necessarily want to ship things that are too unclean, because I think people are using them as part of their daily work process, right? I also think you don't always get the same signal with viable things. You know, the feedback you get can then be focused more around the fact that it's not finished and not polished, especially when a lot of our audience is designers. Polish does kind of mean quite a lot. And so in my opinion, you should be going for the minimum value, which means that it should be something that realistically you shouldn't have to make any changes to keep it in the product. You can add more to make it more valuable and, you know, give the user more to do with it. But I think it should be something that if you left it there and did nothing more to it, it would be valuable and it would fit the feel of the rest of the site in terms of how polished it is, which is definitely a side note from flops, but just what I wanted to pull out.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right there. I mean, like going back to the flop example I had at the start, right, around aggregation, that wasn't an idea that we kind of fully abandoned. Like we came back to it a few times, and I think the most success we had with it was one of the last projects I worked on at that company, actually, which was a kind of like auto savings product, basically, where we were looking at kind of like using aggregation to like look at your finances, figure out like how much you could safely save instead of spend each month, and also doing things like when you spent, like rounding up the change, putting that into an instant savings product. And that was like, I kind of pushed for that quite a bit because I was like, this is where you start to show like value for this. Like one of the problems we often ran into when we were testing the kind of spending money feature was actually most people were kind of like, they maybe had a good idea of how much they could spend, but also wasn't necessarily useful information to them. Like most of the people we were speaking to, you know, who were sort of okay with their finances, was like, I'm either like spending everything I earn every month, or, you know, I'm keeping an eye on my finances so I know, you know, if I need to cut back at the end of the month before payday rolls around. Whereas with savings, it was actually showing people a new way of like using their finances. It was helping them to act differently than what they had been acting in the past. And that suddenly like unlocked it. And we did see like a big increase in the amount of people who started aggregating their bank accounts and started using that feature, because there was that full kind of completion of, you know, this is the value that we as a company are providing. And I think you're right that the way we try and think about things now is, you know, how do we always express like what value should a user be getting out of, you know, the features that we're building. And I think that's like really it's really important, and is often kind of a bit forgotten about in sort of product orgs, because you're thinking about it from the business value perspective, right? In terms of like, we want to increase this kind of user and we want to, you know, increase signups, versus, you know, we want to help people understand, you know, how the design system is being used so that they can make more informed decisions about where to prioritize. That's the kind of value we're trying to get to. And if we're not solving that with, you know, the things we're building right now, then we need to figure out how we get to that kind of point. So yeah, I think that's really valid in terms of calling out value rather than viable.
Yeah, and it kind of plays into the flop theme, because if it's not providing value, I'd consider it a flop. It also is probably one of the reasons people aren't using it, right? So yeah, I guess it kind of takes us to the point of how we deal with flops, and what we sort of do if we think something has flopped. Like where do we go? And I guess like the first thing is how you work it out. And I think we kind of have a bit of an array of how we do it currently. Some of it's around like looking at analytics, seeing the actual numbers. You know, we have tracking on most things we build and seeing if we're getting the expected numbers. But obviously with certain new things, like obviously building like a brand new dev feature set, it's like you don't necessarily know what numbers you're expecting because we have no idea of what the baseline is. And that's where you maybe get other things involved, like user interviews to ask people how they feel about them, why they are or aren't using them, what they would find more useful. But yeah, are there any sort of other things you would be looking for to work out why something's flopped? Or
Yeah, I think analytics is a good one. It's also, worth remembering, even if you're building like a small feature, like make sure you have analytics set up. Make sure like you're not just looking at, a single metric of like usage, but do you have tracking set up so you can follow people through that flow? Too often in other jobs, like we've kind of cut corners on that, and we've been measuring like, the end state, like how many people got a thing set up, and not actually like every step of that journey, because whatever reason we're trying to get it out quickly, and so we didn't really think about like what parts of the flow we wanted to track. And that can often be super revealing because it will potentially tell you like, oh, people are dropping out here, that's the thing we need to fix. I think making sure you run retros, it seems really obvious, but again, I think it's something a lot of teams like struggle with. Like the pressure's always on to like be delivering, and always kind of like if something flops, might move on to the next thing, but actually taking that time to stop, reflect, like what could have gone better. Did you over egg the feature? Did you not like do enough to actually provide full value, or did you maybe maybe there was like a key insight that led you down a particular path, but actually as you look back and reflect, that key insight was maybe a bit too leading, or it came from one team that just like got everyone kind of a bit fired up and created a bit of a false narrative about like, oh, this thing's really exciting. Because I've had that a little bit in the past where you hear a couple of things from a couple of users and it then adjusts the way you kind of like lead conversations with other users, that sort of creates this self-fulfilling prophecy of like, oh, people want this, and then you release it and it turns out no, actually only a couple of teams wanted this thing.
And you just kept talking about it, so everyone's like, oh yeah, we'll have that too.
Yeah, so I think those are definitely the other things, are just like, using it as a time for self-reflection. But also, I guess this might lead on to another question, but is it like knowing if it's like right to actually like call it a flop yet, or whether you need to actually do a bit more to that point of like seeing people are dropping out at a particular point in the journey. Maybe it's flopped now, but actually you can salvage it. Maybe you actually need to iterate and build upon it to just get it over the line and kind of actually really sing as a feature.
I was about to say that's sort of one of the points I was going to jump in with, which was something that I think we've hit a few times. I've definitely hit in previous places as well. It's around like discoverability, because when you have such like a fully built product, especially one that already has like quite a lot of different like entry points, different things you might be doing within the product, when you add in a new feature, you have to realize that unless you make it somehow blaringly obvious, which is often very hard, you also have that factor of discoverability. Is it just that people haven't seen it yet? You don't know what link they're necessarily entering the website on, because when you're working like in a Zero Height style guide, if you're just staying in a style guide, there's so many areas of the product that you might not be looking at, and that might be where we're adding the new feature. And so it could just be that people just literally don't see the button, they don't see the new area. And yes, like you can try different angles, right? There's things like getting a marketing team to shout about the new feature, send out emails, do social posts, and that definitely will bring some people in. There will be other angles like, oh, can we do in-product banners, using whatever tooling you use to basically try and point people at them. But at the end of the day, sometimes a lot of these things get ignored by people these days because there's so many messages constantly going out to everyone that I think people are becoming a lot more blind to. They're just sort of marketing in their face. You have to work out how to make it discoverable as part of the user's existing way of working within a product. And so I think, like part of retroing something that you have added, I think should be not necessarily jumping straight to like, oh, our usage numbers are low, this must be a flop, let's move on. And instead actually going, are they just not finding it? Or are they like finding it and not understanding? And yeah, just working along that sort of line.
Yeah, I think that's the issue, right? Like features don't exist in a vacuum, and looking at like potential external factors, the thing we mentioned earlier around like, is this something that actually someone might just need some time? So maybe they've seen the feature, but they kind of expect that maybe it's going to take a while to set up, or it's just not the right time to do it. My previous role, we were we created a project that visual effects studios were using for kind of managing their pipelines as they sort of tracked CGI work going from kind of like storyboarding right through to like final production assets. And those are like really tightly controlled pipelines. They are kind of set up very early, and then you want work to kind of flow very efficiently. That kind of means that if you're releasing new features that might, impact workflows, or might require people to set up pipelines in a different way, they're probably not going to like use those features until they're at the start of a new project, right? Like it just kind of fundamentally like limits how quickly you can get feedback on whether something is like working or not, and that can be really really tough. But also just means maybe you need to figure out ways that you can find out that data. I know this wasn't a team I was in, but another team that I was working with, kind of, they set up like a sort of customer panel where they sort of knew kind of like where different teams were in their kind of production processes, and they could then like give them early access to features, get them to kind of like sort of test it out and incorporate it into their workflows a little bit more, and use them as like a really kind of like in-depth kind of sort of beta testing group, which is kind of like really cool to see, and get around that kind of thing of like, we only need to release this thing to like a dozen teams versus release it to everyone and then hope that a few teams will like try it and give us feedback. But that's a very like specific way of kind of getting around that sort of issue of, how do you even learn if something's working? I think the other thing as well is like, as you're saying, like, research and interviews, speaking to people who are not using the feature to understand like, why aren't they using it? Did they not find out about it? Is it just not for them? But also people who are using it, even if something is a flop, that you're probably not seeing like zero usage. That probably is some people who've tried it out, like understanding actually like, well, what did convince them to, get to that kind of completed state and start using a feature? Because that can also be quite revealing in cases where, maybe the reason why they completed is they're not kind of the user you're expecting. And so you suddenly realize like, oh, maybe we're kind of like selling this in the wrong way, and we need to go back to the drawing board on that. I think that, I guess, like, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, but I feel like it moves us on quite nicely to when should you then cut your losses and just move on? Like, at what point, do you go, actually, this thing is a failure. We should refocus, move on to the next feature, or even the kind of real end of a situation, just remove it entirely.
This one's such a hard one, and I think is so like dependent on what the feature is. I think some of it comes down to like, if you're talking extremes in terms of like, should we remove it or not? I think a lot of that comes down to what the impact is. Is it having a negative impact? Like, I think if it's having a negative impact, it's quite obvious. You just sort of like cut it out and you're like, no, this is literally doing the opposite of what we wanted. We're seeing lots of people drop out of the flow or whatever it is. Like, you take that out. Another reason I would like try to go around cutting something out is if it takes a lot of maintenance. So, obviously, like some features that you can make in a product, you kind of like make them, you put them in, and they're very self-sustaining. And like, yes, okay, there's code in the background that's happening, but it's not really going to be a big issue. It's kind of fine if they sit there and don't really get used that much. It's not a big deal. But also some features require a lot of like maintenance from like a tech angle, for example. There might be things running that you need to make sure are still like secure or up to date or anything like that. And I think as soon as you've got extra processes in that are happening, you need to consider whether or not what they're achieving is worth the time it costs to keep them going. I think otherwise it's very difficult to tell. I think if it's throwing people off what the main product should be, you can remove it, but I'm not like a big advocate of like, no one's using it, let's take it out. I think the only case I am is when you're maybe replacing it with something better. You know, if you say like, oh, we've released this feature, and like people are kind of using it, but you know, it's not really going that well. And actually, instead, we've had this brand new idea that's similar. It's not exactly the same, it's similar and could kind of replace most of the functionality. At that point, I would try to remove the original one so there's not like confusion between the two of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if you had any differing thoughts.
Not really. I was trying to remember if there's ever been a case where I know of like a feature being like completely removed from like any sort of product I've worked on, and I think no. I think it's quite rare, right? Like I remember like a few years back there was I'm trying to remember who it was. It might have been I don't want to say it was Jira, or like some Atlassian product anyway.
Of course, it was Jira.
Got like moderate praise for the fact that they kind of like did this whole thing of like removing like not massive feature, like it wasn't really being used by many people, but they just sort of like wrote a blog post. I wish I'd checked this before, but it was just a thing of like it did the rounds because it was so rare to hear about a team actually saying like this thing didn't really work. We've decided to remove this entirely because it just doesn't seem valuable. And yeah, so I think that is quite rare. There's maybe a couple I can think of that were like smaller bits and pieces, or just as we like revamped an area of like the banking app that we were doing. We just sort of like we'll drop this feature because it's not really added stuff. It's been kind of a pain to maintain, and it actually just it creates more kind of conflicting requests than it does like drive actual value. I think one was like we had this way of like calculating like net balance, which no one ever agreed like how it should work, because it's like, is your mortgage technically a debt? Is like the thing is like it is, but also
net
like
balance is always hundreds of thousands of pounds down.
Well, yeah, so that's the thing, is like we didn't include it, but then some people are like, this is the thing when you get into finance, right? And it's a side tangent, but you have people view money in very different ways, and that is a challenge. You have some people who, they are much more sort of month to month kind of thinkers, and so debt to them and assets then is like, what's in my current account? What are my credit card debts? What's my monthly loan payment, right? Then you have people at the other end who have a bit more kind of like money. I'm not saying like uber rich, right? They've got money in the bank account, they've got savings, but they also are the sort of people who will look at the fact they own property and go, well, that's an asset. Like I technically like, yes, I owe whatever on a mortgage, but also that's a property I could sell, which pays off potentially that mortgage. So that was always a bit of a challenge, and it just made more sense for us to quietly get rid of that.
Sunset is the word that people like to use.
Very much so. Very quietly sunset that when we sort of revamped the accounts page, because it generated more kind of consternation than it did actual help.
No, I think it can be hard to remove stuff because you're always going to have a handful of people that have used it and will like it. So you're always going to upset at least one person, and it's working out whether or not it's worth it. And that's a hard one. It's a hard one to call. It doesn't really lead on nicely, but there is something I want to do a little hot take of at the end, which is around split testing. We don't use split testing at the moment, which makes me very happy. I'm not sure if I'm meant to admit it, but it does. It makes me very happy. I've been at companies that have used split testing, both well and not so well. And yeah, I kind of want to share my thoughts and also get your thoughts. I think I'm not in the camp of like split tests are bad, never use them, but I think people use them wrong. I think people use them as a way to work out if something's a flop, but not for the right things. Like when you're making a feature, it's very rare that you should split test it. To me, split tests should be used for like small changes with high traffic. So the places I've sort of seen them work is like on e-commerce sites, right? Things like moving the placement of a button. And it seems really small and ridiculous. But actually, you know, if you split test like, okay, if I've got my button at the bottom of the page, they'd have to like scroll to it. Or if I have my button like on the right-hand side, so it's visible no matter where they are on the page. And, you know, that page is getting like thousands of visits. You then actually get valuable data. And it's a small enough change that you know that that is the reason. I've then been at places where they've split tested like a full feature. Like, yeah, let's give 50% of people this feature and the other 50% not. And I'm like, there's so much to it. There's so many things someone could do. We don't know if they're gonna, you know, it goes back to the whole like, do they pick it up quickly? Do they need time? Is it just the wrong time for them? And then making decisions based off a split test of either not enough people or like the right amount of people, but just like completely asking the wrong questions and then bidding off a feature that potentially could have been really good. So yeah, I'm very glad we don't use split tests because I just don't think they would work for us. But I know it's potentially controversial.
Yeah, I basically agree. I think
Perfect.
it's interesting. I think split testing, I felt was much more of like a theme around like UX design and sort of uh, development when I was much more kind of like agency focused and doing a lot more kind of work in sort of e-commerce sites. I think there was a period maybe like 7-8 years ago where like there was a lot of like e-commerce like adopting kind of like UX and sort of bringing some of those ideas into their kind of mix, and split testing was a thing that really took off because you are like really focused on like making those small changes. Like what if you change the way the buy button works? What if you make the change little bits of information to kind of prioritize like the pricing or to prioritize social proofing or any kind of thing, and you're getting high traffic websites where you can bucket people into a bunch of different things and run a lot of like different tests all at once. Super valuable. I think it then got picked up by a lot of people who are like, oh, look at all these like amazing conversion things. And again, it comes back to like, if your focus is purely on conversion, does this page lead to someone to get to this page? Like, that's fine. But for a lot of stuff you work on in product, it is much more about like creating features that drive value, that help people come back, that, are kind of meaningful. And it's much harder to then do split testing. And I would say also, unless you're like dealing with like a huge product, you're probably also not getting the traffic for that thing. So yeah, I'm not a fan. And also like, especially like, in the B2B world, right? You're often dealing with customers where, the product you're working on is something they use day to day. And for me, it's much more important to be predictable. For people to be able to know, where certain features are, and for that to be consistent, so they can build up that muscle memory and that kind of efficiency of use. Obviously, there's not something they're split testing at the moment, but you just look at like Figma and how they've rolled out UI3, and there's been a lot of like criticism of how that has affected designers' kind of workflows in terms of things are now in different places and they're having to like relearn the UI. Split testing, which kind of favors making those small changes and tweaks, is great if you're not, spending all day every day in a product to do your job. I think it makes it much harder to do that and not just piss people off,
annoy everyone. Same as Monzo. I was convinced I had no more savings because all of a sudden my pots were just nowhere. I was like, I don't know where they've gone. I'll have to find them. And I think it's twice since I've had Monzo that they've done a big UI shuffle, and I'm like, I don't know where anything is. Why have you done this? And yeah, they also do it in the whole like phased rollout, like, oh, you're in a beta, and I'm like, I don't want to be in this. I just don't. So yeah, I think yeah, it can definitely be misused as a way to tell if a feature is a flop or not, when it probably should just be used for conversion stuff where it does kind of make sense. Yeah, I think those are all of my thoughts on flops, which is a very hard sentence to say. So on that note, we can wrap it up.